All right, let's jump straight into this. Today's explainer is a fascinating look at how markets function when buyers simply know more than sellers, and how some seriously clever mathematical models can bridge that information gap. We're cracking open the dense, complex world of economic theory to reveal the invisible forces that shape almost every transaction we make. We're going to look at what happens when asymmetric information threatens to completely break a market, and the ingenious pricing structures designed to fix it.
Quick look at our roadmap for today. We've got 5 main stops. First, the adverse selection problem. Second, mechanism design theory. Third, the wine cellar model. Fourth, informational rent and constraints. And finally, we'll wrap up with the continuous standard model. Let's get right to it.
Starting with Section 1, the adverse selection problem, or when buyers hide their true colors. So here's the bedrock issue we're dealing with today. When a seller, the principal in economic terms, can't actually tell who they're doing business with, they risk attracting only the highest risk customers. Think about an insurance company. If they just offer one average rate, healthy people are going to look at that, realize it's way too expensive, and just leave. That leaves the insurer with only high-risk, costly patients. They lose money, and bam, the market collapses. The principal absolutely has to find a way to separate the crowd. Let's make this super concrete. Picture a local wine cellar trying to cater to 2 completely distinct types of customers: the sophisticated buyer and the frugal buyer. Now, legally, they can't explicitly ask which one you are. First-degree price discrimination, looking a customer up and down and quoting a custom price, is usually illegal and, honestly, almost impossible to pull off anyway. You can't just ask someone if they're rich and willing to pay a premium. They're just going to slap on a fake mustache, claim to be broke, and happily take the cheaper price.
Which brings us to Section 2, mechanism design theory, or crafting the perfect trap. Now that we've set up the massive headache our wine cellar faces, let's look at the analytical toolkit used to actually solve it. Mechanism design, well, it feels almost like psychological engineering. You can kind of think of it as the science of reverse engineering a menu of options so perfectly that buyers just naturally expose their true characteristics through the choices they make. The seller sets up a game. By carefully tweaking the quality and the price, they design a scenario where the buyer's absolute best strategic move is to act exactly how the seller wants them to, revealing their true type in the process. And here is a massive shortcut for the math, the revelation principle. This brilliantly proves that we only really need to focus on menus that make honesty the single most profitable strategy for the buyer. Instead of getting tangled up in endlessly complex mind games and bluffs, this principle guarantees that if a solution exists, it can be achieved just by offering a menu where the sophisticated buyer looks at their options and naturally thinks, you know what, the expensive option is actually the better deal for me.
All right, Section 3, the wine cellar model. Let's visualize the discrete math.
Okay, if our seller had a magical crystal ball, they'd use what we call a first best strategy. But since they don't, they have to settle for a second best approach. In a first best world, the seller knows exactly how much you value that bottle of wine and charges you precisely that amount. You're left with 0 extra benefit, or 0 surplus. But without that crystal ball, the seller has to offer a menu that forces self-selection, and that inherently means they're going to have to leave a little bit of money on the table. Take a look at these 2 curves. They show perfect price discrimination, extracting every last ounce of value from both the sophisticated and frugal buyers, leaving them with exactly 0 utility. On the vertical axis, we've got the transfer of money, so the price, and on the horizontal axis is the quality of the wine. These curves represent the absolute maximum price each buyer is willing to pay for a given quality. At points Q1 star and Q2 star, the seller perfectly matches the buyer's willingness to pay with the cost of production. It's 100% efficient. But again, completely impossible if the seller can't actually identify who's who.
But here's the catch. If the seller just blindly tries those first best prices, well, the sophisticated buyer is simply going to pretend to be frugal. If both options are sitting there on the table, the sophisticated buyer will look at the frugal option. Sure, it's lower quality wine, but at a drastically lower price, and realize they get massive surplus by choosing it. The original plan completely unravels. So the seller has to adjust, perhaps moving the sophisticated offering over to point A, just to regain some of that lost profit. So by mathematically shifting the quality and price, we find this optimal second-best point where the seller maximizes virtual surplus without causing the sophisticated buyer to defect. The seller deliberately downgrades the cheap wine, pushing it to the left on the graph, purely to make it unappealing to the rich buyer. Then they drop the price of the high-quality wine just enough so the sophisticated buyer is indifferent between the two. The tangent lines you see here, they perfectly visualize this incredibly delicate balance. Moving to Section 4, informational rent and constraints. Basically, the rules of the game. To really understand why that last graph works, we have to decode the mathematical constraints holding the whole thing together. Mechanism design isn't just guesswork, right? It operates on strict algebraic boundaries. For this wine menu to function at all, the frugal buyer must actually want to buy something. That's individual rationality, meaning the deal is better than walking away empty-handed. And the sophisticated buyer must actively prefer the expensive bottle over the cheap one. That's incentive compatibility. It's the mathematical guarantee that lying just isn't profitable. You absolutely have to satisfy both of these simultaneously to have a working market. By rigorously proving out those constraints, the text distills some really heavy math into these 5 simple, universal rules that define any discrete adverse selection model. Notice how the highest type, our sophisticated buyer, gets a top-tier, perfectly efficient allocation. Meanwhile, everyone else gets their quality intentionally downgraded. And the lowest type? They're squeezed completely dry. They're left with strictly zero surplus, while the higher types walk away feeling like they scored a great deal. It's actually amazing how these 5 properties beautifully interlock. What this essentially means is that the sophisticated buyer gets a discount. It's basically a bribe, paid by the seller, just to stop them from buying the cheap, frugal wine. This informational rent is literally the core cost of doing business in an asymmetric market. Because you have a secret, your true wealth and taste, the seller essentially has to pay you to reveal it. Finally, Section 5, the continuous standard model. Let's scale things up. Now we're jumping from our simple 2-buyer wine shop to a continuous model that represents a whole population of varying tastes. Because in the real world, consumers aren't just strictly frugal or sophisticated. We exist on an infinite, continuous spectrum. Notice how these indifference curves only cross exactly once. This is the famous Spence-Meernes condition. It mathematically transforms endlessly complex global constraints into simple, solvable, local ones. If these curves tangled and crossed multiple times, the math would be a nightmare, literally impossible to solve. But crossing just once guarantees that wealthy buyers and budget buyers have consistently different tastes, making them easily sortable. This elegantly proves that as long as wealthy buyers value a quality upgrade more than budget buyers do, a seller can successfully sort them by offering larger allocations at premium prices. It's the exact same reason airlines can get away with charging 5 times as much for a first-class ticket, even though it only costs them a little bit more to provide a slightly wider seat. They're exploiting this exact sorting condition to segment the business travelers from the vacationers. So I'll leave you with this to ponder. How much informational rent have you managed to keep in your own life by carefully guarding your true type from the market? Every single time you pick a cell phone data plan, choose a software subscription tier, or select an insurance deductible, you're playing your part in a brilliantly designed mechanism. You are revealing your type. This math is literally everywhere, invisibly optimizing our chaotic world, one contract at a time. Keep your eyes open out there, and thanks for joining me for this explainer.